Hi, let's talk about fake news. What people are maligning as fake news is really just a the fact that Hollywood has reached a saturation point in terms of the kind of stories that it's able to tell. And you have to remember that the capacity to mislead people is part of propaganda, right? You want the countries and people to appear either more interesting than they really are, or just more powerful than they really are as a deterrent. And there's a question as to whether or not, that kind of propaganda is still necessary when you have so much data now and the ability to analyze that data using satellites. And in fact, that technological leap is what is behind the battle between the old technologies of propaganda and the new ones. In other words, the new guard, right, the ones that are led by data analysis and drones and so on, they're not as enamored with this idea of the risk-reward analysis or ratio of the old technology. And let me give you an example. One of my favorite movies is My Fair Lady, starring Audrey Hepburn. Well, that's what is that, 80 years ago, about? In that movie, Audrey Hepburn's voice was dubbed for a lot of the songs. Audrey Hepburn was a dancer, not a singer. But when you watch the movie, you can't tell anyone's voice has been dubbed. You go up into the modern day, a more modern example would be the band Milli Vanilli. And again, there was a whole scandal when I was growing up about that band sort of misusing the ability to lip sync. And remember, these bands, unlike Audrey Hepburn, would have live concerts. And so they would be singing not only in videotapes, presentations back then, they would be singing live in dubbed voices. It wasn't just Milli Vanilli. Another scandal that came out around the same time was a great dance band called CNC Music Factory. And it was kind of like, Europop. But the female singer of the two was again outed as, using somebody else's voice. And the reason for that is because the female singer in that band was, whoever was the front woman was extremely attractive, much more so than the woman who was offering her voice as, who was really the one who was singing, who was really the one with talent. And you can see as we moved away from radio into television why it would be natural for any sort of propaganda agency to come in or department to do exactly what they've been doing all along. Not only is it more aesthetically pleasing, but it works. There's one of the more recent examples that hasn't been exposed, and I'll warn you right now that I'm speculating, but it's this, I think it's called America's Got Talent, or The Voice of America. It was about a man who was working in a French supermarket, Carrefour, or Europe's Got Talent, probably. And he came in and delivered an opera. One of my favorite songs, Solo Mio. And it was somebody that, is, again, this is a live performance, right? Somebody who won, I think, I believe he won the entire competition. So you can see that, is it possible for somebody who's a supermarket clerk in a grocery store to have the same ability as essentially a professional opera singer? It's not impossible. Right? That's the thing that makes all of this possible, is that we want to believe in miracles. But if you think about technology, and if you look at the history of the entertainment business, what you're really looking at is, again, the ability to dub voices live and on the screen. Why is this a bad thing? One of the reasons it's a bad thing is because if you have the ability to dissemble, it seeps into the government as well, because a lot of these people, to the extent they're able to generate marketing dollars, are protected by the local police. That's why so much of the industry in Hollywood is in one place, in California. which also happens to be the place where O.J. Simpson was allegedly beating his wife, Nicole Simpson, and got away with it, allegedly. And of course, there was a trial for homicide later on. And a lot of tragedy has resulted. But interestingly enough, the power structure behind that group included Kim Kardashian's father. And one of the stars of Hollywood today is none other than Kim Kardashian, who grew up hanging out with O.J. Simpson. So you can see that there's a bit of a network here that is attempting to stay in power, but in a way that, I'm not going to say shocks the conscience, but in a way that probably misuses what propaganda was really designed to do. Because in a sense, propaganda is just advertising. What you're supposed to do is you're supposed to come up with a product and then, or a service, and then advertise that value or service in a way that tells people, or that improves people's lives. And there's a sense that once you've hit a limit in terms of how to do that, especially in America, where for the most part, half the country, is, I'm not going to say poor, but half the country is not maximizing its potential. And that is hard to see, especially when you go outside, because there's so much development, infrastructure, things seem to work. But again, is it working in a way that's sustainable? Or is it really just a debt-fueled system that's based on the ability to mislead people about the real prosperity, behind the values of your country? Now, we saw what happened in 2016. There was a backlash in 2016 in the national elections. And again, that's another consequence. And we saw that, by the way, the police unions were the ones that were backing the outsiders, quote, outsiders campaign. Although, of course, Donald Trump is not an outsider. He went to an Ivy League school, just like the majority of presidents in the past in this country, in modern history. So you see that there's an entire power structure, right? You've got the universities, which don't pay taxes. You get a lot of money from the federal government. And both, I would say, well, the tax exemption is worth quite a bit of money. But obviously, when I go to school, I take out student loans. A lot of those loans pay interest to the federal government, not just to private banks. So the whole thing is a business that trickles down into a debt-based system that never really intends to pay off the debt. It just wants to roll it over. And that's really behind all of this, right? The idea of investment stability. So it's not just propaganda in order to warn other nations or to compete with other nations. It's also just this idea that I'm trying to convince the investment market, people with money and talent, obviously, to partake in your system, to put their money in your bank accounts, in your banks, and so on. And then use that currency in order to create a plan of development, both intellectually and in terms of infrastructure. And again, there's a sense that all this is sort of failing because people are fed up with a teleprompter style of presidency, of being led, of leadership. And you can see the real fundamental problem with having a dubbed voice, because, in theory, right, it's always been that way, right? Presidents have always read other people's words. They haven't written their own speeches. And that's one of the reasons why some presidents have been actors, right? Donald Trump was featured on a few television shows. Ronald Reagan was an actor. There's a reason for that. And so there's a sense that about half the country has essentially given up on this teleprompter style of leadership. And the real fundamental problem is that if there's a temptation to misuse technology, and in doing so, rob not just your own nation, but the whole world of authenticity. And there's a sense that it's a crutch, right? If you can't develop intellectual leaders that have something worthy to say, but can go through the motions of capturing your attention, there's a sense that we ought to be able to do both. But there's also another sense that, like I said, the speechwriters tend to be introverted. They don't want the limelight. And there's a sense that there is a benefit in having a technology that allows you to get the best of both worlds. The extroverts' desire for attention, and the introverts' desire to be left alone while contributing to society. And so you can see the reasons why this sort of a structure has sort of evolved to where it is today. And you can also see why it's also dangerous for the future progress of the country, especially if a lot of the values are really run by debt and rolling over that debt in order to maintain the status quo. And so, that's something we want to think about whenever we see anything. I once said that everything you see is propaganda. And, even if you want to try to reach back and get information that's not available, that's not readily taught, you have to have a basis for that. If I want to know about colonial India and I go on Google and I put in Mumbai, there's a chance, you should be able to see the problem with that if you have, if you were growing up, if you're of my generation. Because of course, Mumbai is a new term. It used to be Bombay. So you would have to know that, right? You would have to know if you want to learn about colonial China or maybe the history of Hong Kong, you would have to know that when you search for a term online, that not only would you put in Peking, Peking, rather than Beijing, but you would just have to know that the algorithm isn't converting your search terms into the updated version. So there's always been a tendency for Hollywood, just for media companies, to try to change the past, and it's become much easier now that we've moved away from an analog format or a microfilm format that's a hard copy that's tangible into something that's intangible and digital. And you have to remember something. The other reason I call Hollywood a propaganda agency is really because it's an intelligence agency. If you're an intelligence asset, you can't walk into, say, a foreign country and advertise that, right? You have to be given a cover job, a teacher, a journalist, and so on and so forth. But it's even easier if you're bringing in cash, right? If you're a Hollywood director, you're bringing people in, and you're going to tell a story that requires you to talk to people and get their information. And this is something that the Germans. It's not a coincidence that the Germans under the Nazis loved movies and were making quite a few of them. And so every government tries to stay in business, and it is a business, using the most convenient path. And in many cases, that convenient path is not based on authenticity. Authenticity is difficult, right? It's not smooth. It's not made for television. And again, it's not just these live talent shows that are scripted. A lot of people realize that almost what you really figure out is not only are most television shows scripted, even the ones that are called reality shows, but even the publications you read are in a sense scripted. They're not actually soliciting letters or input. They're providing it. They're making the news rather than reporting on the news. Because again, on the one hand, life is wonderful, but on the other hand, it's mostly boring. And if you want a government to stay in business, especially if that government is spending a lot of money on the military, the police, and other types of governmental, or I should say a government with an imbalanced budget that tilts towards a security state has to rely on propaganda, because security does not provide anything productive. It is the underlying foundation for other productive activities, which also includes attracting immigrants and attracting talent, right? So you're trying to attract talent, resources, and you're trying to do so voluntarily. And that, by the way, was a secret behind Napoleon's success from France, is that he didn't have to fight very many wars, right? If you look at the French motto, right, it's something that is universally appealing. And so Napoleon in the West is, or at least in the United States, is unfortunately not as recognized as he should be in terms of his military prowess. But he was really, it's not just him, by the way. He had I think he had sons that managed to follow in his footsteps, and one of them went down to Mexico to try to conquer it. And that's one of the reasons why you see riads, R-I-A-D-S, in Northern Africa, which is obviously also where the French went. That's why the government's down there, and the official language of the law is still, in many cases, in French. The Egyptians have a pound, by the way. That's their currency, the pound, which is, of course, what the English use for their currency. And so you put all these things together, right? You have this idea that what you really want is, if you're going to rely on propaganda, what you want is for that propaganda to generate some sort of universal value that you can back up. But you can't really do that if debt is what's really driving the entire system. And that's one of the reasons, because, and I've talked about this before, once you have an excessive amount of debt, especially within government budgets that improperly, tilt the budget into unproductive activities, unproductive activities that are still necessary. If you have that kind of a system, there has to be it's very difficult to roll it back. Because what are you going to do? You've got people that understand these tactics, and what really are you going to do? And I think that's one of the questions we're struggling with right now in the West. As more and more people realize it's not just the media, it may even be the outcome of sporting events. We know that the Russians manipulated, I should say the Soviet Union, at one point in time manipulated the Olympic outcomes. So again, it's not just one country doing this. Any country that wants to be a superpower, it tends to do so in modern times through the military. And there's a question. Of course, there are different styles, but all those styles depend heavily on the military. And since the military is, especially now, is in a position where it's doubtful that the kind of funding that's going into it is still generating the kind of rewards and the kind of progress that we need relative to the spending, the easiest path is to continue with the propaganda. And that's actually probably one of the reasons why most empires eventually fail, because they take the easy path. And there's a question overall, if say the outcome of a sporting event might be preordained, if that's linked to a worldwide gambling situation that perhaps benefits the black market. There's a sense also that intelligence agencies are almost bound by duty to go into those markets and try to take them over. And in order to do that, you have to infiltrate those markets, right? So that's what the vice squad of a police department is. They're trying to infiltrate these markets. And that again, is another temptation that is difficult to resist, is once you take it over and you're in a position where you can have the judges essentially protect your confidential informants, there's again another temptation, right, to continue the system as it is rather than replace it with something better, which is, of course, the entire idea of progress. And hopefully you can also see why, how all these things, as they come together, why, a lot of the reason that you're not able to understand other countries and other cultures is because it's not an authentic system. It's not really going to other countries in order to learn from them. It's not really trying to advance your intellect. And that, of course, to the extent that all these systems, whether it's education, political, governmental, and so on and so forth, to the extent that all of this is tied together, under the umbrella of having to pay off debt, you can see how the system is, while at the same time being destined for failure, can be self-sustaining as long as it can issue that debt and maintain power. We can also see why that tendency to hold on to power, despite not being able to provide actual progress, can lead to revolutions by people who are fed up with the lack of authenticity. And that may explain, on some level, right, say the Chinese Revolution. It may explain on some level, why the United States lost the Vietnam War. It may explain a lot of things about the 21st century. And as you're sort of thinking about these things, you want to think to yourself, well, what's the solution? And is it to become a Luddite? Is it to go to a community of Mennonites and Amish, people that have recognized the power, probably earlier than most, of these sorts of destructive technologies? How do you achieve a balance within a country that is run and led by an imbalanced budget? How do you do that? And I think that's the question that I'm hoping to answer myself. And hopefully, we can try to answer that question together before it's too late.